The German shepherd named Valor suddenly ignored every call from his mistress. He barked furiously, claws ripping into the damp soil beneath the lilac bushes of an old Vermont farmhouse. Nora Whitaker, a young bride hoping for nothing more than peace in her new home, tried to dismiss it as a dog's whim, but Valor's relentless digging forced her to take a shovel. What she unearthed wasn't a root or a stone, it was a thick, rusted chain, buried deep as if it was holding back a terrible secret. That chain led her to a sealed iron box hidden for decades, and what waited inside would not only shatter her quiet life, but would unravel a deadly truth her whole town had tried to bury. Cedar Ridge, Vermont, was a town that looked gentle at first glance, a place where clapboard houses lined narrow streets, and the church steeple pierced through morning fog like a slender finger pointing heavenward. Yet the seasons here were never soft. Winter bit deep into the bones, spring brought floods from thawing rivers, and even in early summer, cold winds rolled down from the green mountains, rattling shutters and reminding newcomers that nature ruled first, people second. On this particular morning, the sky was washed in a pale silver light, clouds dragging low, the kind that promised more rain before noon. The air smelled of wet pine and the faint sweetness of lilac drifting from a garden just beyond the old Whitaker farmhouse. Nora Whitaker knelt in that garden, hands sunk into dark soil. At 26, she carried the fresh glow of someone standing at the threshold of a new life. She had married only 2 weeks ago, and though her wedding dress still hung in the closet upstairs, her attire today was plain and practical. A faded denim shirt tucked into brown work pants borrowed from her husband, sleeves rolled to reveal pale, freckled arms that had known more books than dirt until now. She was slender, almost fragile in build, with long auburn hair tied back beneath a white kerchief, and a complexion fair enough to flush pink under the slightest sun. Yet her green eyes carried a brightness, the steady spark of determination, as if she had decided that this little farmhouse, with its cracked beams and stubborn shutters, would truly become her home. As she leaned forward to press peony roots into the earth, a heavy thud followed by sharp barking broke the rhythm of her work. Valor, her German shepherd, had abandoned his post on the porch and charged toward the lilac bushes with unusual urgency. He was 6 years old, in the prime of his strength, with a coat of sable and silver that caught the morning light like metal. His chest was broad, his muscles thick from daily patrols across the property, and his amber eyes were filled with the kind of loyalty that comes only from a dog who has lived every day as both guardian and companion. Yet today, his loyalty expressed itself as frenzy. He clawed furiously at the damp ground, scattering clumps of soil, his tail stiff as a board. "Valor!" Nora called, brushing dirt from her hands. "Stop digging, you'll ruin the roots." The dog ignored her, something he rarely did. Normally obedient, he responded to her voice with immediate respect. But now his instincts seemed locked onto something unseen, something hidden below. His growls rolled deep, vibrating in the morning stillness, until Nora felt them in her ribs. With reluctant curiosity, she rose to her feet and crossed the garden, boots sinking into the wet grass. She crouched beside him, reaching out to catch his collar, but Valor jerked free and dug harder. His paws scraped against something that rang out with a metallic clang. Nora froze. It wasn't the dull sound of stone, nor the soft tear of a root. She brushed soil aside with her bare hands and unearthed the rounded edge of a thick, rusted iron link. It was larger than any chain she had ever seen, heavy and pitted with time, as if it belonged to a ship's anchor rather than a country garden. The link disappeared downward into the dark earth like the spine of some buried beast. "What on earth?" she whispered, running her thumb across the rough surface. The cold metal left a streak of orange rust against her skin. She looked around instinctively, as though expecting a neighbor to appear at the fence and explain the mystery. But the farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane, bordered by a thin forest on one side and an abandoned pasture on the other. There was no one to consult, only the steady breath of the mountains and Valor's insistent whines. Reluctantly, Nora stood, brushed off her palms, and fetched a shovel from the shed. The tool was old, its wooden handle smoothed by years of use, but it fit her grip like an extension of her arm. She returned to the lilac and drove the blade into the soil. The earth was damp, soft from last night's rain, and came away easily. Valor stayed close, his nose twitching, his entire body taut with anticipation. For several minutes, Nora dug in silence. She uncovered link after link of the iron chain, each one heavier than the last, all bound together in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. The links led deeper, wrapping around something larger. Sweat gathered at her brow despite the cool air. Her arms ached, but determination anchored her movements. Finally, the shovel struck something broad and solid. The vibration jarred her bones. She knelt, scraped with her hands, and exposed the surface of a small steel box, rectangular and military in design, its olive paint dulled by decades underground. The box was bound in 2 turns of the same rusted chain, secured by a padlock so corroded its keyhole was barely visible. Mud clung to its corners, and a faint smell of mildew wafted upward. Nora sat back on her heels, breathing hard. She glanced at Valor, whose ears twitched forward, amber eyes fixed on the box as if urging her to continue. But a chill had already crept into her chest. Something about the weight of the discovery felt wrong, as though the lilacs that had bloomed year after year were guardians of a secret better left untouched. She touched the chain again. The iron was cold, colder than the air, and seemed to hum faintly against her fingers. It wasn't just a garden oddity. It was an anchor holding down something forgotten, maybe even forbidden. For a moment, she considered reburying it, returning to her peonies and pretending nothing had ever happened. After all, she was new here, an outsider in a town where families traced their names back generations. She knew Cedar Ridge tolerated newcomers but trusted only its own. To disturb the past might mean disturbing the fragile peace she and her husband had barely begun to build. Yet the box seemed to pulse with presence, its silence louder than any bird call. She couldn't ignore it. She had unearthed something that wanted to be found, and Valor had guided her to it with an insistence too fierce to dismiss. She wiped her muddy hands on her pants, stood slowly, and whispered to the dog, "Whatever this is, boy, we'll face it together." Valor barked once, sharp and clear, as if in agreement. The sound echoed through the damp air, startling a crow from the trees. Nora looked at the box again. It sat half buried in the roots of the lilac, a mute relic demanding attention. She knew she would have to drag it inside, to study it under proper light, to discover what secrets it carried. But for now, the morning felt heavier, the air thicker, and her once peaceful garden had become a place of unease. The day had begun with the promise of blossoms and routine. It ended with the weight of iron in the soil, the chain of silence broken, and the first threads of a mystery that would pull her deeper into the hidden heart of Cedar Ridge. Nora stood in the kitchen with the box on the table, the damp metal leaving dark stains against the wood. Morning light slipped weakly through the lace curtains, illuminating specks of dust that seemed to pause mid-air as though the house itself were holding its breath. Valor sat by her feet, head tilted, amber eyes never leaving the iron box, as if he sensed that within it slept something dangerous, something that might reshape their lives. Her hands trembled slightly as she fetched a hammer and a short pry bar from the drawer where Ben usually kept loose tools. She was no stranger to house chores, but she had never broken into anything in her life. The padlock that bound the rusted chain around the box was so corroded it seemed almost part of the metal itself. She struck it once, twice, and on the third blow the brittle shackle cracked, the chain uncoiled, and the box exhaled a faint odor of mildew, paper, and something like dusted leather. Nora pushed the lid open. Inside, carefully nested though time had warped their edges, were 3 objects: a tarnished sheriff's badge, a silver locket dented on one side, and a leather-bound journal swollen with moisture. The badge was the first thing she touched. Heavy and green with corrosion, it still bore faint letters across its surface. Sheriff Arlen Pike. She remembered the name dimly from something Maeve, the librarian, had mentioned in passing during a town welcome luncheon. That Sheriff Pike had been in office for decades before stepping down in the early 90s. Nora imagined a man hardened by small-town power, his face appearing in every parade, every council meeting, every whispered decision behind closed doors. The badge felt colder than the chain had been, its edges biting into her palm. She set it aside and lifted the locket. Its clasp resisted her fumbling fingers, but at last it popped open, revealing 2 tiny photographs, so water-damaged they were more ghosts than images. One seemed to be of a young woman, the other of a man, their features blurred beyond recognition. Pressed into the opposite side was the faint imprint of a lilac petal, crushed flat, a strange token that still held the faintest suggestion of perfume. Finally, with deliberate care, she picked up the journal. The leather cover was warped, corners dark with rot. She laid it beneath the lamp and, with patient fingers, eased the first page open. The ink had bled, but words still stood out, written in looping script. June 2nd, 1979. He smiled at me today by the church steps. His eyes are sunlight, his laughter quick. To think a man from such a family would notice me. It feels like a dream I must not speak aloud. His name is Everett. Nora read the lines twice, feeling a twinge of recognition. Everett Davenport, the name that still commanded respect in Cedar Ridge. The Davenports owned the sawmill where her husband worked, the bank where mortgages were signed, and much of the town's silence. The diary unfolded, like a confession. The writer was Hannah Gable, a seamstress in the church choir, 19 years old. She described her days with hope, her evenings with whispered meetings by the covered bridge, and her heart that leapt each time Everett touched her hand. Her words painted her as tall and slender, dark-haired, with skin that tanned quickly under the sun of long sewing days. She sounded eager, trusting, almost fragile in her innocence. But with each page, Nora felt the tone shifting. July 14th, 1979. He grows colder when I speak of our future. He says his father would never allow it. He says my name is too small for their house. The script became tighter, lines pressed hard into the paper. September 3rd, 1979. Sheriff Pike came to me. He said Everett must think of the family, of his inheritance. He said I must remain quiet for the good of Cedar Ridge. His eyes were like winter water, beautiful, but deadly. Nora's chest tightened. She could almost see Sheriff Arlen Pike, a tall, square-jawed man with thinning blonde hair slicked back, dressed always in a neat brown uniform, eyes sharp and cold. A man who carried authority like a second skin, and who demanded silence not with kindness, but with the threat of what he might unleash. The final entries came hurried, words jagged, almost scrawled. November 21st, 1979. He told me to meet him at Birch Hollow Bridge. Sheriff Pike said it was safe. that it must be done quietly. I am afraid. If I do not return, know this: I did not leave of my own will." Nora shut the book, her heart hammering. She looked at Valor, who shifted closer, pressing his nose to her knee as if grounding her back to the present. She stroked his fur, her mind racing. Hannah had not simply disappeared, as town whispers suggested. She had been silenced, her story hidden under chains and roots until Valor unearthed it 40 years later. Her gaze returned to the badge glinting dully on the table. Sheriff Arlen Pike had carried authority in 1979. Everett Davenport had carried wealth and entitlement. Together, they had pressed a girl into silence, and the evidence now sat in Nora's farmhouse kitchen. The rain outside thickened, striking against the window panes in steady sheets. The farmhouse seemed smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of the secret it now held. Nora felt torn between fear and duty. She had not asked for this. She was just a bride, trying to make a garden bloom. Yet fate had delivered Hannah's voice to her hands. She whispered aloud, "What am I supposed to do with this?" Valor answered with a low growl, his ears flicking toward the window as if expecting shadows to arrive. Nora pressed the journal shut, slid the locket on top, and placed the badge over them both. Together they felt like pieces of a puzzle too dangerous to leave exposed. She covered them with a tea towel, though she knew cloth would hide nothing. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Its sound carried through. The rain, a reminder that the town still moved in rhythm, unaware of the past pushing up through Nora's garden. But the seed had been planted. Hannah's whispers from 1979 would not be silenced again. The rain had ceased by late morning, leaving Cedar Ridge washed and shining, its narrow streets glistening like veins of silver under a reluctant sun. Nora walked briskly along Main Street with a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. Inside, carefully wrapped in a scarf, lay Hannah Gable's diary and the tarnished locket. The sheriff's badge she had left hidden at the farmhouse. Its cold weight had unsettled her too much to carry openly. Valor padded at her side, a steady guardian, his wet paws leaving prints across the brick walk. The town library sat at the corner opposite the church, a sturdy brick building dating back to the 1920s. Its arched windows framed shelves upon shelves of history that most people never touched. For Nora, the place was both intimidating and comforting, the kind of building that felt like it remembered more than it revealed. Behind the circulation desk stood Maeve Collins, the librarian. At 68, Maeve had the calm dignity of someone who had spent her life among books and secrets. Her hair, silver with faint streaks of its original chestnut, was pulled back in a low bun. She was tall and thin, her posture still elegant despite the years, and her skin bore the pale translucence of New Englanders who lived more with books than sunlight. Maeve's brown eyes were softened by time, yet sharp when focused, the eyes of a woman who had seen too much left unspoken. Maeve looked up from the ledger she was writing in, and her expression warmed with genuine welcome. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, her voice a measured alto, steady but touched with warmth. "I was hoping to see you again. Settling into the old farmhouse?" Nora hesitated, then placed the satchel on the desk. "I found something," she murmured. She unwrapped the scarf enough for Maeve to glimpse the worn leather cover of the diary. Maeve's eyes widened, and for a moment the librarian's practiced composure slipped. She reached out with long, careful fingers, tracing the edge of the diary without lifting it. "Where did you—" She stopped, her lips tightening. "No, don't tell me yet. Let's go somewhere private." She led Nora and Valor down a flight of creaking stairs into the library's basement archive. The room smelled of dust, ink, and time, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed faintly overhead. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with old town records, yearbooks, and bound volumes of the Cedar Ridge Chronicle. In the center stood two hulking beige microfilm readers, relics from the 1970s themselves. Maeve gestured to a wooden table. "Sit, let me see." Nora laid out the diary, opening it to Hannah's first entry. Maeve's hand went to her mouth as she read the looping script. Her voice, when it came, trembled. "Hannah, I sang beside her every Sunday. She was sweet, shy, with a voice like spring water, 19 and full of dreams." She closed her eyes, as if hearing again the harmonies of a choir that had long since fallen silent. She vanished that autumn. The official story was that she left town to find work, but I never believed it. Nora leaned forward. "You knew her?" "I did," Maeve said. "We were friends. She confided in me once that she was seeing someone, but she never said who. Just that he made her heart soar and her stomach twist all at once. And then, she was gone. I asked questions. Sheriff Pike told me to stop, said I was stirring up gossip." Maeve's gaze darkened. "It haunted me, the silence, for decades." Nora nodded, her throat dry. "The diary names him, Everett Davenport." Maeve's face hardened. "Of course, the Golden Sun. The Davenports always had a way of bending truth until it fit their version of history. And Pike, he was their ally. He kept the town clean on paper, no matter the dirt underneath. Together they scrolled through rolls of microfilm, the faint whirring filling the silence. Headlines flickered across the screen. County fairs, high school football triumphs, weather reports. Then Maeve slowed the reel, her finger pausing on a small column buried on page 6 of the November 1979 issue. The article was only a few paragraphs long. "Local young woman, Hannah Gable, reported missing. Authorities suspect she left town voluntarily in search of employment. Sheriff Arlen Pike confirmed there is no evidence of foul play." Nora stared at the words, fury rising in her chest. They erased her. They made her disappearance sound like a choice. Maeve adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "Look here, in the margin." She pointed to a faint, handwritten note, almost lost to time. "Hannah left choir practice with ED." Maeve's voice shook. "That's my handwriting. I wrote it when I first read this paper. I knew it mattered." But no one listened. The basement air grew heavier, as though the building itself carried the weight of secrets. Nora reached for Maeve's hand. "You weren't wrong. You were the only one who saw." Before Maeve could reply, the sound of polished shoes echoed on the stairs. A figure descended slowly, each step deliberate, as if claiming the space. Silas Davenport entered the archive. He was in his early 70s, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still imposing despite age. His hair was a precise silver, combed neatly back, and his face bore the stern symmetry of old money. Thin lips, sharp cheekbones, and eyes so pale they seemed to wash out color around them. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth, the kind that did not need to boast. A heavy gold ring gleamed on his right hand. His presence chilled the room. He did not glance at the shelves or the microfilm reader, only at the women. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said smoothly, his voice rich and practiced, like an orator who had given too many speeches at town banquets. "Miss Collins, how fortunate to find you both here." Maeve stiffened. "Mr. Davenport. To what do we owe this interruption?" Silas smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "I hear you've taken an interest in our town's past, Mrs. Whitaker. Cedar Ridge treasures its history. Some chapters, however, are better left closed." Valor rose, hackles stiffening, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Silas's gaze flicked to the dog with a hint of distaste before returning to Nora. The Whitaker farmhouse sits on land adjacent to mine. Old boundaries blur in these hills. My family has always considered it part of our estate. I'd like to make you an offer. Generous, far above market value. Enough to set you and your husband comfortably elsewhere. Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. We're not selling. Silas's smile lingered, but his eyes hardened. Think on it. Peace in this town is delicate. People who disturb the dust of the past rarely find contentment. He adjusted his cuff, nodded politely, and turned toward the stairs. His footsteps receded, but the weight of his presence lingered like smoke after fire. Nora exhaled slowly, valor pressing against her leg as if anchoring her. Maeve's face was pale but resolute. You've stirred something long buried, she whispered, and now they know. The silence that followed wasn't peace, but warning, as if the whole town were holding its breath again, waiting to see whether truth or power would prevail. The farmhouse at Cedar Ridge usually stood as a beacon of quiet evenings, lamplight glowing through lace curtains, the smell of pine logs burning faintly in the stove. But that night, the silence was wrong. Too thick, too absolute. Nora Whitaker sat in the parlor, wrapped in a knitted shawl, trying to reread the pages of Hannah's diary by the dim beam of a battery lantern. The words wavered across the faded paper. If I do not return, know that I did not leave willingly. Her hands trembled. Then, without warning, the single overhead bulb flickered, hissed, and died. The hum of the refrigerator fell silent. The comforting tick of the clock stopped. The whole house surrendered to darkness. At the same moment, Nora's cell phone, perched on the table by her elbow, gave a soft chime and went black. No signal. No power. No line to the outside world. Valor stirred at once. The 6-year-old German shepherd rose from his spot by the hearth, ears pricked and body taut. His coat of sable and cream caught the thin spill of moonlight from the window, highlighting every muscle as he growled low and steady. He pressed close to Nora's legs, eyes trained on the front window, his entire body warning her that something unseen prowled nearby. Nora's husband, Ben Whitaker, was not there. He worked the night shift at Cedar Ridge Lumber, an old sawmill on the far side of town. Ben was 29, with sandy blonde hair and a physique carved by years of physical labor. He was ruggedly handsome in a modest way, with kind green eyes that smiled often, though his face carried the hardened angles of a man who had known responsibility early. He had been raised by a widowed father after his mother's passing, which had etched into him a sense of duty so fierce it sometimes left him blind to dangers at home. Tonight, duty kept him at the mill while his young bride sat in darkness. Nora rose slowly, crossing to the front window. She drew the curtain back an inch. At the far end of the dirt road, where the birches leaned like watchmen, 2 trucks sat idling with their headlights off. Their hulking shapes were just visible in the silver wash of moonlight. Silent predators waiting. No engines rumbled, no voices carried, but the weight of their presence was as palpable as a hand pressing against her chest. Valor's growl deepened. His hackle stood rigid along his spine. Nora whispered, "Easy, boy. I see them too." She let the curtain fall and backed away from the window, heart hammering. Her first instinct was to call Ben, but her phone remained stubbornly lifeless. She checked the landline in the kitchen. Dead as well. Lines cut. Someone wanted her alone. Unreachable. She sat for several moments in the dark kitchen, her mind racing. To wait here was to wait for them to come to the door. And she knew instinctively these weren't neighbors, weren't lost travelers. These were men sent by Silas Davenport or those who bowed to him. Their silence was a message. We see you. We are close. We can come whenever we choose. Instead of curling into fear, Nora felt a stubborn flame rise in her chest. She would not be another name erased, another woman silenced. She thought of Maeve's haunted eyes in the library basement, the way her hand had trembled over the microfilm. Maeve had spent 40 years carrying the guilt of not saving Hannah. Nora would not add her own silence to that legacy. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. Her reflection in the hall mirror startled her, dark hair loose around her shoulders, pale face lit only by the lantern's weak glow, lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She looked less like a bride and more like a widow in waiting. "Not tonight," she whispered fiercely. She slipped the diary and locket into her satchel, then whistled softly. Valor padded to her side, tail stiff, ready to follow her wherever she led. Together they slipped out the back door into the cold Vermont night. The air was sharp, tinged with the resinous bite of pine. Clouds had thinned, leaving a waning moon to scatter silver across the frost-crisped grass. Nora kept to the tree line, moving quietly along the narrow trail that led toward Birch Hollow. Maeve was waiting there. They had agreed earlier to meet if anything happened, to seek answers where Hannah's diary had pointed. The old wooden bridge spanning the creek. The trail wound downward, shadows of bare branches crisscrossing her path. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of twigs under her boots, the whisper of Valor's breath, the far-off hoot of an owl. Twice she paused, holding her breath as distant engines coughed to life, and then fell silent again. She knew those trucks were still watching her farmhouse, unaware she had slipped into the woods. At the edge of the hollow, a lantern glow flickered through the trees. Maeve Collins stood waiting by the wooden bridge, her long coat wrapped tight around her thin frame. She held the lantern low, its circle of light illuminating the planks worn smooth by decades of weather. Her expression was grim, but her eyes steadied when they found Nora. "Nora," Maeve whispered, relief flooding her voice. "I feared you wouldn't come." "They cut the power," Nora murmured, approaching quickly. "And the phones. Trucks are outside the house. They want me silent, but I won't hide." Maeve's face tightened. "Then we're already in the thick of it. Hannah wrote of this place. The bridge, the creek. If there's more truth to be found, it lies here." Valor paced along the edge of the bridge, nose pressed to the planks. He whined once, then pawed at a loose board near the railing, ears pricked as if he heard echoes from another time. Nora crouched, running her hand across the weathered wood. Somewhere beneath their feet lay secrets buried longer than either of them had been alive. The wind picked up, rattling the birches. Nora looked across the creek and thought she saw a shape shift among the shadows. Her breath caught. Was it only her imagination? Or had someone else come to watch what they would uncover? She tightened her grip on Valor's collar, and Maeve lifted the lantern higher. In the faint glow, the old bridge seemed to tremble, as though holding its breath for the secrets it still carried. The night was no longer quiet. It was waiting. The night around Birch Hollow was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the birches and the faint creak of the wooden bridge, swaying ever so slightly in the current. Nora held the lantern Maeve had brought, its glow trembling in her hand. Maeve stood beside her, one palm resting on the railing, her thin shoulders hunched as if bracing against a memory. Valor sniffed the ground in widening circles, his muscles taut, ears twitching to every sound in the night. Then, without warning, he froze. His body stiffened, tail rigid, nose pressed to the earth beneath the tangled sprawl of wild grapevines that clung to the far side of the bridge. A low whine slipped from his throat, followed by a furious scratching of his paws. Soil sprayed against the roots, scattering pebbles and damp leaves. Nora dropped to her knees. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, brushing vines aside. At first there was only dark soil, the smell of damp wood and moss. But then Valor's claws snagged something pale, something not stone. A fragment of bone, weathered and fragile, protruded from the dirt. Maeve let out a strangled sound, part gasp, part sob. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she pushed her glasses higher up her nose. Her lined face was pale under the lantern's light, the grief of 40 years etching itself fresh again. Valor dug harder, unearthing more fragments until the outline of a shallow grave began to emerge. There, amid the bones, lay a simple band of metal, a thin, tarnished ring dulled by decades in the earth. Maeve clasped her hand to her mouth. "That's hers," she whispered hoarsely. "Hannah's ring. I remember it. Cheap brass with a glass stone. She wore it to every choir practice. She said Everett once admired it, even though it wasn't worth more than $1. She said it made her feel chosen." Her voice cracked, and tears blurred her eyes. And now here it lies, in the dirt with her. Nora held Maeve's trembling arm, her own heart thundering. They had proof, not just whispered words on old pages, but bones and a ring that could not be denied. She imagined what it would mean if the authorities saw it. But before she could speak, Valor stiffened again, his growl turning savage, vibrating deep from his chest. From the shadowed edge of the clearing, 2 men stepped forward. They moved with the confidence of predators who believed the night belonged to them. One was broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with a thick black beard streaked by gray, and a crooked nose that had clearly been broken long ago. His eyes were flat, colorless, betraying no hesitation. He gripped a length of iron pipe, tapping it idly against his palm. The second was thinner, wiry, with a long face and hollow cheeks. His blonde hair was cropped close, his mouth curled into a sneer that revealed a gold tooth glinting in the moonlight. He carried a short crowbar, swinging it loosely in his hand, as though it were an extension of his arm. The heavy one spoke. First, his voice a low growl. "Ladies shouldn't be wandering around out here. Dangerous, especially at night." Maeve's voice was tight with fear but steady. "We know who sent you." The wiry man chuckled. "Then you know we can't let you keep what you found." His tone was casual, almost mocking, but his eyes betrayed cold purpose. Nora gripped the lantern tighter, her throat dry. The 2 men advanced slowly, the air thick with menace. Behind them the birches swayed, shadows dancing like silent witnesses. Valor moved first. With a roar that split the silence, he launched himself forward, a streak of silver and black. His powerful body slammed into the wiry man's chest before the crowbar could rise. The man staggered backward, crashing into the soft mud near the creek bank, the crowbar clattering into the water. Valor stood over him, snarling, his teeth bared inches from the man's throat. The bearded, heavy-set man cursed and lunged toward the dog, pipe raised high. Nora acted without thinking. She swung the lantern in a wide arc, the glass shattering against his shoulder. Flames sputtered as kerosene sprayed, forcing him to drop the pipe with a howl of pain, the night filled with the acrid scent of burning fuel. "Run!" Nora shouted, grabbing Maeve's hand. They sprinted across the bridge, Valor tearing himself away from the wiry man at the last instant to follow. Behind them, curses and shouts filled the clearing. Branches slapped against Nora's face as they plunged into the woods. Her lungs burned, every muscle screaming, but adrenaline pushed her forward. Maeve stumbled on a root, nearly falling, but Nora pulled her up, refusing to let her falter. Valor raced beside them, ears back, keeping close as if guarding their very breath. Then, slicing through the darkness, came the sharp, rising wail of sirens. At first distant, then closer, echoing through the valley. Red and blue lights flickered faintly between the trees, growing brighter with every passing second. Maeve gasped. "The state police! Someone must have called them!" Nora didn't slow, her heart hammering as the sound swelled. The men who had ambushed them would not dare linger now. The forest itself seemed to exhale, as though relief coursed through the branches. They burst from the woods onto a narrow logging road, collapsing in the ditch just as 2 state patrol cars roared past, tires spitting gravel. The sirens howled toward Birch Hollow, the night alive with their warning. Nora pressed the diary against her chest, Maeve clutching Hannah's ring in her fist. Valor panted heavily but stood watchful, scanning the road as if ready to fight again should shadows return. Nora whispered through ragged breath, "We're not alone anymore. They'll have to listen. Hannah's story is coming back." As Nora, Maeve, and Valor stumbled out of the woods onto the logging road, the wail of sirens grew louder. Patrol cars sped past them, lights flashing towards Birch Hollow. Nora clutched Maeve's arm, breathless, and whispered, "They'll see the grave. They'll see the ring. Hannah won't be silent anymore." Maeve nodded through tears, holding the small brass band against her chest. Together, under the glow of police lights cutting through the night, they told the first officer they met everything they had found. By dawn, Cedar Ridge would no longer be able to deny the truth buried beneath its soil. The morning after the chaos at Birch Hollow dawned gray, the air heavy with the dampness of a storm that hadn't quite broken. Nora Whitaker sat at the edge of her porch, Valor at her feet, as flashing lights and official vehicles crowded the road that wound down to the bridge. The state police had sealed the area, their men in pale coveralls moving with clinical precision. Shovels pierced earth, evidence bags crackled, cameras clicked. The bones that Valor had uncovered were no longer fragments of rumor. They were the undeniable remains of Hannah Gable. Maeve stood beside Nora, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Her shoulders trembled under her long gray coat. For decades she had carried Hannah's absence like a silent wound. And now, seeing her friend's life reduced to tagged bones and a tarnished ring, her grief looked raw and new again. A man approached them from the roadside cluster of cruisers. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair and the calm, penetrating gaze of someone who had long practiced sifting truth from lies. He introduced himself as Detective Samuel Harker of the Vermont State Police. His suit was plain gray, the knees damp from kneeling near the excavation, but his shoes shone with an almost obsessive polish. His jawline was sharp, flecked with stubble that spoke of a man who lived more in the field than behind a desk. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, voice even but edged with urgency, "and Mrs. Collins. We've confirmed preliminary identification. Female remains, approximately 19 years old at time of death, consistent with Hannah Gable. The ring you found was crucial. The medallion, too. And the journal." He paused, glancing toward Nora's satchel, where the warped leather book rested. "That journal could be the nail in the coffin." Maeve swallowed hard. "Then the town will finally know." Detective Harker's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "The town will know, yes, but the Davenports aren't the sort to accept shame quietly." By afternoon, the news had spread beyond Cedar Ridge. Reporters descended like crows, their vans lined along the main street, satellite dishes craned skyward. Headlines splashed across regional papers. Remains of missing choir girl found after 40 years. Hannah's face, pulled from an old yearbook photo, smiling, bright-eyed, a dark braid over her shoulder, was suddenly everywhere. It wasn't long before Silas Davenport made his move. He arrived at the station in a black Lincoln, escorted by 2 lawyers in tailored suits. Silas, in his late 60s, was tall, silver-haired, with a posture honed by decades of commanding boardrooms and backroom deals alike. His skin was weathered but unlined by worry, his pale blue eyes cool and unyielding. He wore a dark wool overcoat, a silk scarf knotted neatly at his throat, the embodiment of wealth and authority that had gone unquestioned for generations in Cedar Ridge. Detective Harker was present for the interview, Nora and Maeve observing from a corner through the 2-way glass. Silas removed his gloves with deliberate calm, placed them on the table, and folded his hands as though beginning a polite conversation at a country club. "I will not insult you by denying the remains are Hannah Gable," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "The truth is painful, but it is time it came out. It was my younger brother, Everett. He was reckless, passionate, and tragically irresponsible. There was an accident. He pushed when he should have held her. Words turned into panic, and she fell." She struck her head. "It was not murder, Detective. It was a mistake of youth." He paused, eyes flickering with what seemed like sorrow. "I was but 20 myself. I found Everett in terror, weeping over her. He begged me to help him. And I made the foolish choice to protect the family name. I buried what should have been confessed. I chained her box. I told Sheriff Pike to close the case. I have lived with that shame for 40 years. Maeve's fingers clenched at her sides. "Lies," she hissed under her breath. Nora held her arm, eyes fixed on the performance. Silas continued, his tone rising with carefully measured emotion. "I am not proud, but I swear to you, Everett meant her no harm. I take responsibility for the cover-up. If punishment must fall, let it fall on me, not on a boy's memory, long dead." When he finished, the room was silent. The 2 lawyers beside him nodded solemnly, as if his words had been rehearsed and sealed. But Detective Harker leaned forward, his gaze unblinking. "That's quite a story, Mr. Davenport. Convenient that Everett cannot speak for himself." Silas spread his hands, palms upward. "The dead cannot defend themselves, Detective, but I can. And I am telling you the truth." In the observation room, Nora pulled the journal from her satchel. She opened to the last page, pressing her trembling finger against the jagged scrawl. "If I do not return, know that I did not leave willingly." When the journal was placed on the table before Silas, the mask slipped only for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. He recovered quickly, offering a weary sigh. "The diary of a frightened girl," he said. "Emotional words, not evidence." Detective Harker flipped the book toward him. And yet the badge of Sheriff Pike was in the same box. The medallion, the ring, buried deliberately. That doesn't spell accident, Mr. Davenport. That spells conspiracy. The cameras clicked outside the glass as reporters jostled for any glimpse. For decades, Cedar Ridge had been bound by silence, the Davenport wealth and Pike's authority shaping what was spoken and what was forgotten. But now, with bones on a table, with the words of Hannah's own hand, silence was breaking. Later that evening, Nora walked with Maeve down the main street. Shop windows glowed with evening lights, but conversations hushed as they passed. Some faces were sympathetic, others fearful, but all carried the weight of truth finally clawing its way to daylight. Valor trotted at Nora's side, tail low but steady, his presence a shield against the eyes that followed them. Maeve spoke softly. For 40 years, this town lived under a shadow. They believed silence was safer. But Hannah is speaking again, and they will have to listen. Nora nodded. She knew Silas would not yield easily. His confession was a clever weapon, part truth, part poison, designed to shield himself while casting the blame on a dead brother. But the ring, the medallion, the diary, they told a different story, one the town could no longer ignore. The air in Cedar Ridge was changing, and with it, so too was the balance of power. The chill of late spring clung to Cedar Ridge, though the snow had long receded from the fields. At Birch Hollow, where the creek whispered under the weathered wooden bridge, townsfolk gathered in solemn silence. A granite slab had been raised upright on the embankment, its polished face catching the light of the morning sun. Fresh chisel marks spelled the words the town had once buried in whispers. Hannah Gable. Remembered. The memorial was simple, yet powerful. No grand sculpture, no flowery epitaph, just her name, and the word that meant everything now, that her story, once silenced, was finally acknowledged. Nora Whitaker stood near the front of the crowd, her hand clasped firmly in Maeve Collins's. Maeve wore a long navy dress beneath a cardigan, her gray hair pinned carefully back. She looked frail, yet her eyes carried a resilience that surprised even Nora. For Maeve, this moment was 40 years overdue. Valor lay at Nora's feet, head resting on his paws. His golden eyes scanned the crowd with quiet vigilance, his sable coat gleaming in the new sunlight. People who had once looked past Nora now looked at her differently, their gazes softening, some even nodding in gratitude. She felt no pride, only a quiet ache for Hannah and all the years she had been denied. Ben stood beside his wife, still in his work jacket from the mill, the smell of sawdust clinging faintly to him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair mussed from long shifts and a face both rugged and kind. He slid his hand into Nora's and squeezed gently, his green eyes catching hers. His voice was low, meant only for her. "You've brought light to this place," he said. "You've given it back a name it tried to bury." The ceremony was led by Reverend John Alcott, a man in his late 50s with thinning brown hair, round glasses, and a presence more gentle than commanding. He had been young when Hannah disappeared, only newly ordained. That memory had haunted him, the way the congregation was told never to speak of her again. Today his hands shook as he opened his worn leather Bible, his voice thick with emotion. "We gather not only to remember Hannah Gable," Reverend Alcott said, "but to confess what silence cost us. We cannot undo the past, but we can honor her life and vow never again to let truth be buried under fear." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Families who had kept their heads down for generations looked up now, eyes meeting for the first time over the weight of what had been denied. Detective Samuel Harker stood a little apart, his plain gray suit marked with dust from the unpaved road. He observed quietly, notebook in hand. His presence reminded everyone that justice was not complete, that Silas Davenport's confession was unraveling under scrutiny, that more trials and hearings would follow. But today, the law stepped aside, allowing grief and healing to take precedence. Maeve stepped forward when the Reverend invited her. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear. "Hannah was my friend. We sang together every week. She laughed too loud sometimes, and she dreamed too big for this town. And when she vanished, I let myself be told she had gone away. But I knew. Deep down, I knew." She pressed a hand to the cold stone. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I should have fought harder. But we are here now. Your name will not be lost again." Her words drew tears from many eyes, Nora's included. Even Ben brushed at his cheek, though he tried to hide it behind a cough. After the ceremony, people lingered, leaving flowers, candles, even scraps of ribbon tied to the railing of the bridge. It was as if Cedar Ridge had been holding its breath for 40 years, and finally exhaled. Later that afternoon, Nora returned to her farmhouse. The day was warmer now, the air scented with thawing earth and fresh growth. She moved to her garden patch, kneeling beside the freshly turned soil. Her hands pressed into the dirt, steady and deliberate, as she planted rows of peony bulbs she had bought from the nursery weeks earlier. The ground felt alive beneath her fingers, ready to carry new color into the world. Valor lay in the shade of the old lilac bush, his ears flicking lazily, yet his eyes never fully closing. He seemed to know his duty was not finished, that shadows still lurked in Cedar Ridge, but for the first time in weeks, his body was at rest. Ben walked out from the porch and crouched beside her. He placed his calloused hand over hers, pressing her dirt-streaked fingers into the soil. "These will bloom strong," he said. "They'll bloom for her," Nora replied softly. She looked toward the horizon where Birch Hollow lay, the granite stone standing like a sentinel. "For Hannah, for Maeve, for all of us who needed to remember." When the first peony finally opened weeks later, its petals flushed a brilliant, impossible pink against the green. Nora felt a shiver run through her chest. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. A small miracle in the heart of Cedar Ridge. She knew then that the town had changed. It would not erase its scars overnight, but it had spoken Hannah's name aloud. And that was where healing began. The loyalty of a dog, the courage of a bride, and the memory of a forgotten girl had joined together to force justice into the light. Nora touched the bloom gently, whispering a prayer of thanks, not just for what had been won, but for what was still possible. And in that quiet garden, Cedar Ridge learned to call truth by its rightful name. Sometimes God's miracles don't come as thunder in the sky or fire from the heavens. Sometimes they bloom quietly, like a peony in the spring, born from loyalty, courage, and the faith that truth will not stay buried forever. Nora's hands, Maeve's memory, and Valor's steadfast heart became the tools through which light returned to a place long ruled by silence. And just as Cedar Ridge learned to name the truth, so too must we in our daily lives, never afraid to stand for what is right, never ashamed to carry the memory of those who came before us. Because in every small act of courage, in every whispered prayer, the Lord reminds us that He sees, He knows, and He brings justice in His perfect time. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it so others may believe in the quiet miracles that still shape our world. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to our channel to journey with us through more stories of faith and loyalty. And may God's blessing rest upon you and your loved ones.